Was God manifest in the flesh, or was he manifest in the flesh? Hey YouTube, it's Pastor Dwayne here. Today we're going to be taking a look at the textual variant in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16. So before we get into it, let's read the passage so you know what I'm talking about here. Now I've got the New King James Version loaded, so come on over to the screen and let's read it together. And without controversy, great is the mystery of godliness. God was manifested in the flesh, justified in the spirit, seen by angels, preached among the Gentiles, believed on in the world, received up into glory. Now, depending which Bible translation you have, this verse will be a little bit different. So if we just take a look at a couple other translations here, the Berean Literal Bible has who was revealed in the flesh. Doesn't say he who. That's an interesting one. The translation difference. He appeared in the flesh. He was manifested in the flesh, English Standard Version. The New Living Translation, let's see. Christ was revealed in the human. Well, we're not going to use that one because it's way... the NLT is just way out there as far as its translation philosophy. I'm not a big fan of it. But the New International Version, he appeared in the flesh. Okay, so the question here is, what are we looking at? Did the original writer mean to say God was manifest in the flesh? Or he who was manifest in the flesh? Oftentimes you hear someone say, and I mean, I've said it before too, right? Like, the differences between the editions, they're not really that major or anything. But I think this one is a little bit different. So what we have here is if the passage tells us God was manifest in the flesh, then that's a very direct reference to a core biblical teaching, which is the Trinity, right? Father, Son, the Holy Spirit, God manifest in the flesh is definitely saying that Jesus is God and he came in the flesh. But when you have he who was manifest in the flesh, we would immediately think Jesus. We wouldn't think God. And so what would occur is that leaves a few things open as far as to suggesting that, well, this passage isn't talking about Jesus being God. So I think this is an important one. Now, of course, that's not to say that the Trinity isn't found elsewhere in the scriptures. Of course it is. But if this passage is meaning to say God was manifest in the flesh, then, let's not remove the force of this passage if what was originally written was God. So the first thing I did to kind of take a look at this is I took a look at Metzgers Commentary. Now, I found Metzgers Commentary to be a little bit frustrating at times, but he went through and they documented a lot of the decisions they made in regards to why they went with specific readings. So he's got a rather big write-up here on 1 Timothy 3:16, and I'm not going to read the whole thing here. You can see it on the screen. So he lists out the manuscripts that support each variant reading. And I don't know if you can see, but Hos, which is he who, not God, he who, he's listed as Aleph, so that's Siniaticus, Alexandrinus, the Codex C, Ephraimi Rescriptus, and Codex G. He lists these as support for he who, and then he comes down and lists a few more items here in support for Theos, which is God who, which is Aleph, Aleph with the corrector, Alexandrinus with the corrector, Codex C with the corrector, Codex D with the corrector, and then a couple other manuscripts here. But in concluding about the uncials, he says, thus, no uncial in the first hand, earlier than the 8th or 9th century, supports Theos. So he's suggesting that everything does not support Theos, that it's not a reading. So I went and looked at this, and I was actually quite surprised to find that when he references uncials earlier than the 8th or 9th century, we have a grand total of 5 manuscripts. 5 manuscripts that refer to this verse in 1 Timothy. So I found this a little misleading, giving us the impression that there was a few more, there's a little more support for not Theos, but in reality it comes down to 5 manuscripts. Now I've found them here, and we're going to take a look at each one relatively quickly. The one thing we need to be aware of when talking about this is the similarities between the phrase he who and Theos in Greek. If we come back to my screen here, this would be, as I'm trying it out here, this is the Greek letters for hos. So this is the word he who, right? It's a masculine pronoun, and it refers back to a word, or at least it's supposed to. But there's some difficulty here because grammatically, there is no referent for that. So when we put he who, we don't know what he is referring to. So we just assume that it's he because it's masculine. Now, if we wanted to take this and make it into God who, we just simply add 2 lines here. the omicron becomes a theta, and then the nomina sacra makes it into theos. So I'll show you again here. So this is he who, and that is God who. So when we look at the manuscripts, you can see how easily it would be to confuse the two. Now, if we come up here, if we load up our manuscript, we'll start with GA1. It's at Siniaticus. So Siniaticus is listed as supporting he who, and it's right here, right there. I wish I could like draw a big red circle here. That would be good. But it's right there. See, omicron, sigma, hos, right? But if you look here, you can see that somebody came in later and put in 3 little dots and added in theos. So it was corrected. Now, the date at which this correction, I think Metzger puts it somewhere around the 12th century. Like just about anything else in textual criticism, this is probably debated. But anyway, so that's Siniaticus, what the modern text critical scholar would say is probably the most important witness, generally speaking. Now, I don't agree with that assessment, but nonetheless. So the second Uncial manuscript we look at is Codex Alexandrinus, and this is one of the more interesting ones because I know it's a little bit hard to see. Let me see if I got. It's a little bit hard to see, but it's right here. Okay, you got an omicron or a theta and a sigma, and then you have a line here. Now, if you look at the literature here, a number of people have suggested that the line in here, which you can barely see, if at all, maybe you can just kind of very, very barely see. You probably won't be able to see it after all the compression of the video upload and all that. But some have suggested that this line here, which marks this as theos, right? Remember our picture, right? That the line here was added afterwards by a corrector. So I did a little bit of digging to try to see how they figured it was a corrector. And it was either Tischendorf or Tregellus had suggested that perhaps it was a corrector because of the color of the ink on here. Now, that's interesting that he uses the color of the ink argument because Philip Payne had used the color of the ink argument to determine the distigma in Codex Vaticanus. But when the new research was done by Ira Rabins and Nehemiah and Gordon Nehemiah, they suggested that maybe it wasn't a good idea to be relying on color to determine when these dates are. But so if that's true, then we might have to rethink what's going on here. But the one thing also that you're going to notice here in Alexandrinus is you're going to see this weird little X inside of the omicron or the theta. And what that is if you flip over, I'll just zoom out here so you can see. If you go to the page behind it, this is literally the page behind it. You can see right here, there's the nomina sacra. And in behind there is where you would see the theta and the sigma. But this letter here, the epsilon here, okay, that's an epsilon. Or is it? Yeah, and that's an epsilon. You can see the little crosshatch in there. See, that's actually bleeding through the page. And what you're seeing is, over one more. And what you're seeing there is that epsilon on the other side of the page bleeding through. Anyway, that's just an interesting thing. And another interesting tidbit about this manuscript is somebody had written, I'm trying to track it down, and I will eventually, and we'll do a video on it. But somebody had said they had seen the lines in there originally, but then they had faded with time. Again, we'll take a look at that another time. So that's the other one. You can see it's not so cut and dry with he who, is it? Now I want to pull up the next manuscript. This is Codex Ephraimi Rescriptus. Now I just took a screenshot here and put it into Paint because this one's a bit tougher to see. This is one of those palimpsest manuscripts, and that a palimpsest manuscript is when there's a text on it and it's like scraped away so that the parchment can be reused. So they scraped away the biblical text and then they put some other stuff over top of it. Again, I'm not entirely sure what's on top of it, but underneath it is the biblical text, and it was barely noticeable. And then I think sometime in the 1800s, whether it was Tischendorf or Tregellus, I keep getting those guys mixed up. They gave it a chemical bath and were able to pull out the text that was underneath. And lo and behold, it's like essentially a whole New Testament. So in this picture here that we're looking at is our passage in 1 Timothy. And it's very difficult to see, but you can make it out if you look closely enough. Let's see if I can zoom in. But it's right there in the middle of the page. You can see the theta. Okay, it's right here. Whoop. I'll do red. You can see the theta right here. Oh, right. Let me draw. There we go. You can see the theta right here. Okay, that's the theta. You can even see the crossbeam here to make it a theta instead of a sigma. And then if you look here, you can see the sigma. Okay, and then of course everything in there, that's just the black ink from the overtop text. But the interesting thing here is if you look closely, you can see the line here indicating nomina sacra. This looks like, this is good. Codex Ephraimi Rescriptus, 5th century manuscript. We have proof of a 5th century manuscript that has the reading theos. But the suggestion here is that this is a correction, that a corrector came a little bit later and added that into the text. Now, to me, right, when I'm looking at that's like impossible to tell. Like you just can't tell. I would be interested to see details on who and why they suggested that this was done by a corrector. So I don't particularly see this as hard and fast proof that this manuscript reads as he who. It looks like it reads as God who. So those are the 3 main witnesses. There is another witness here, which is interesting, just worth discussing because it's such a weird one. So this is Codex D, and this one's really cool because you can see what's going on here, right? So based on the color of the ink, right? If we want to just kind of suggest that, color of the ink is determined that's later, probably is because, you can see the other markings on there. But the theta was added. Here, let's zoom that in. Yeah, so you can see that theta was added afterwards, and so was that. But the question is what is going on here? What is going on here? So that looks like a sigma, right? Looks like a sigma? Okay, good. Looks like a sigma. So this is listed in the apparatus and the commentaries as being a reference to an omicron instead of a sigma. Why? Because, well, it looks like it might have been an omicron, and then somebody erased out a chunk of it to make it into a sigma. So it's suggested in all your apparatuses and in all the commentaries and such that the theta and the nomina sacra line came a little bit later. Somebody added that to the text and kind of scratched out the one side of the omicron because this would have been an omicron that the original scribe had written in the 5th century. So that's a reading that is by itself in the uncials. It's by itself in the uncials. You don't see that, I don't think, in many other Greek manuscripts, if any. But we do see that sort of idea come over into the Latin manuscripts. And so the Latin manuscripts seem to hold on to the tradition of having the neuter pronoun there. So that's Codex D. Again, another interesting one, but I don't think it really has major reflections on the text. So we have Codex Siniaticus, Codex Alexandrinus, Codex Ephraimi Rescriptus, Codex D, and then there's one more. I think it was Codex 061. I'll have to double check that to see. But I just kind of, it's a low quality image because I just kind of scraped it off the INTF site. This is obviously, you're not going to be doing any major study from this image. But what we can see is the one in question, okay, is different than all the rest. So this is a very odd reading. It's an omega instead of an omicron sigma or theos. So it's the mystery of godliness by which is revealed, and so on and so forth. So this reading is just on its own. There's no other manuscripts that I'm aware of that contains an omega, where everyone else is either omicron sigma, or theta sigma. So that's it. Those are the 5 witnesses that we have of 1 Timothy 3:16 before the 9th century. When you compare that against the Byzantine manuscript tradition, I haven't seen the numbers yet, but I mean, if I had to guess, it's going to be somewhere in the hundreds of manuscripts that read theos. It's pretty coherent family. And when you check out When you check out the not yet available Greek New Testament, a comparative edition, it shows you quite plainly that if this passage reads he who, that's a critical text reading, or if it reads theos, that is a Byzantine reading, whether it's F35, whether it's KX, whether it's Hodges Farstad, whether it's the Byzantine text, across the board, that's just what it is in the Byzantine tradition. Now, and then looking back at Metzger's phrase. So let's pull up our paint window here, and let's do a little tally. Okay, so let's do he who. Okay, he or God, and then we'll just do other. Okay, so we have Siniaticus, okay, here, but then Siniaticus corrector here, okay. So that's one for he and one for corrector, okay. And now, whether that's 12th century or earlier, okay, that's probably debated. But then we have Alexandrinus, okay. So Alexandrinus is suggested that it was originally he, but was corrected. Again, we don't know when that correction took place. Now, I would debate if this is even the case. Okay, then there's Codex Ephraimi Rescriptus, which is apparently he. So we'll put Ephraimi. We could use their symbols, but it's just more fun this way. But then it's corrected to God. Now, it's not a B, it's an H. Now, I am not entirely certain if that's corrected. I think there's some question there. And then we have Codex D, which is just weird. Okay. It has ho, right? But it has also been corrected here. And then there's, I think it was 061. This one here. I might be wrong there. Might have been. I've been looking at so many manuscripts. This is funny. Well, I'll just say it's 61. And if it's not, we'll just correct that. And that had the Omega reading. So that one's not really any good for us. So out of these 5 manuscripts, the picture doesn't look so clear. And so I want to come back to what Metzger said in his commentary when he says, thus, no uncial in the first hand earlier than the 8th or 9th century supports theos. That may be true, but it leaves us with a picture that is not quite as intense as Metzger seems to be suggesting. So I'm not entirely sure. So I'm not entirely in agreement with Metzger here. Now up front, right? I'm a Byzantine guy. I don't believe that God was manifest in the flesh hangs on these 5 manuscripts. I think that the Byzantine tradition is large enough and cohesive enough to warrant trust in what's coming out of that. So I'm good with God who, either way. So that's just to say that I'm coming in here with a bit of a bias, right? I might be looking at this a little bit different than someone who's like a critical text guy. But nonetheless, I just wanted to point out here how it's not as straightforward as seems to be suggested. Now, we only went into a little bit, and as I was kind of looking into this issue, it became evidently clear that this was much bigger than I was going to be able to do in one video. So I'll probably make a few more videos on this variant in 1 Timothy 3:16. Maybe take a closer look at some of the stuff we've talked about and go from there. Anyway, brothers and sisters, I hope you found this video informative, and until next time, we'll see you around.